Hey everybody, welcome to my C# for Unity Fundamentals series. There's already a ton of C# tutorials, so I wanted to try to do something a little bit different. I want to really hone in on 5 basic but really important concepts for beginners. In game development, you'll be using a lot of the same fundamentals over and over and over again. So in this series, I really want to dive into things you'll be using in almost every single script you write. So if you're new here, please subscribe to my channel and let's go ahead and get started with today's tutorial. Okay, so this is part 1 and I'm going to be going over variables. Now the obvious question is, what is a variable? And we use variables to store information that we'll need to reuse. So an example would be, say you're playing a role-playing game and at the beginning you create your own character and you give your character a name, and then later if the game needs to recall your name, it knows what it is because it is stored in a variable.
Mr. Assface.
Most of the C# tutorials I've seen, they start by listing out all the different kinds of variables that you can use. Like on this website, for example, they start by listing the bool, byte,
char, decimal, double float, integer, long, s-byte, short.
But for this series, the only one we're really going to be focusing on right now is the float. This is the type of variable you'll be using to create most of your gameplay. So what is a float? Well, a float is just a decimal number like 0.1, 5.7, 6.3, these are all floats. And whole numbers can also be used as floats. And by using float variables, we can control things like how fast the player moves or how fast the camera moves. Really any type of movement usually uses a float type variable. A really basic example would be if I had a float called speed and it was 1.5, I could move my player character across the screen at a speed of 1.5. And you'll notice here that first we define what type of variable we're making. In this case we're making a float, and then we're giving it a name, and I'm just naming it speed because that's the speed the player is going to move. And then we'll use the equal sign to give the variable a value, and the value is 1.5. and when you're using a float you always end it with an F, and then we use the semicolon as sort of a period to end this line of code. And now for this example I have a way of storing how fast the player should move. He should move at 1.5, which is an arbitrary number. It will make more sense once you start getting into your game. So that's a really basic example of how to use a float variable. And we'll be getting more into this as we move through this series. But the next thing I want to go over is components as variables. Now in this sample scene I have a box right here that I made. Nothing special. So every game object you create will usually come with a few components already attached. For example, this cube I created has the transform component, which every game object has to have. And it also has a mesh filter, a box collider, and a mesh renderer. And you can change any property of these components through scripting. So for example, this mesh renderer, this is what draws the box on screen. So if I uncheck it, notice how it sort of disappears. You still see the outline there, but it's not rendered anymore. You have to actually have the mesh renderer enabled. But say I didn't want it enabled. Well, I could go into our script and make a mesh renderer variable. That's the type of variable, and then we'll give it a name, and sort of the standard naming convention for this is just to call it rend. Or say we wanted to access this box collider Once again, all we would have to do is make a variable, and we'll call it call. That's another sort of, that's another standard naming convention you'll see a lot. Now you'll notice that these variables don't have the equal sign that the speed variable has because we haven't given it a value yet. And in the next tutorial I'll be going over how you use something called getComponent to assign a value to these variables so you can use them in your script. So that will wrap up part 1. If you found this helpful, please subscribe, and I will see you in the next tutorial.